When the Queen Mother died on March 30th, 2002, she owed Coutts Bank £7 million. £7 million. She'd maintained 4 fully staffed residences, employed roughly 100 servants, drunk Krug champagne every single day, and kept a stable of racehorses that would have made a sheikh blink. And 25 miles from her London front door, not 300, not 3,000, 25. Her niece Katherine Bowes-Lyon was living in a care home, wearing clothes that had belonged to other patients, having never once received a birthday card from anyone in the family. Her other niece, Nerissa, was already dead. Had been since 1986, buried in Redhill Cemetery under a plastic marker, the kind they use when no family claims responsibility for a headstone. This is a story about 2 ledgers. One tracks the spending of one of the most extravagant women in British public life. The other tracks what that same family spent on 2 of its own blood relatives who'd been locked away since childhood. You don't need a calculator to see the problem. You just need a conscience. Let's start with the money going out. The Queen Mother's annual expenditure in her final years ran to roughly £4 million per year. Her civil list allowance, the public money Parliament allocated for her official duties, stood at £643,000. So she was spending more than 6 times what the state gave her. The gap was covered by her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, through the Privy Purse. Year after year after year, the Queen quietly bankrolled her mother's lifestyle because the lifestyle wasn't negotiable. And what made that arrangement so perverse was the public image sustaining it. The British public adored the Queen Mother, genuinely adored her. She was the nation's grandmother, the woman who'd stood on bombed-out streets during the Blitz and refused to leave London, who'd famously said she was glad Buckingham Palace had been bombed because now she could look the East End in the face. That myth, the plucky wartime queen, the smiling matriarch, the woman who waved from balconies and charmed everyone she met, that myth was worth billions in public goodwill. It's what made Parliament keep funding her civil list allowance without serious challenge. It's what made the press treat her spending as an eccentricity rather than a scandal. The nation loved her so much that nobody asked too loudly where the money was going. And nobody asked what she wasn't spending it on. 100 members of staff. Think about that number. Butlers, footmen, under-butlers, pages, dressers, housekeepers, cooks, kitchen staff, chauffeurs, ladies' maids. Across 4 properties: Clarence House in central London, Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, the Castle of May on the northern tip of Scotland, and Burke Hall on the Balmoral estate. Staff wages alone consumed somewhere between £1.5 and £2 million a year, and every one of those properties had to be heated, maintained, provisioned, and staffed, whether she was there or not. The Castle of May is the one that galls. She bought it in 1953, spent a fortune restoring a dilapidated 16th-century castle on the coast of Caithness, and used it approximately 5 weeks a year. 3 weeks in August, 10 days or so in October. The other 47 weeks, fully staffed, lights on, nobody home. A castle maintained at enormous expense for the pleasure of knowing it was there, waiting, in case she fancied the Scottish coastline for a fortnight. Now let's look at the other ledger. In 1941, 2 girls were placed inside the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Redhill, Surrey, a Victorian institution that had opened in 1855 under its original name, the Royal Earlswood Asylum for Idiots. That was the actual name. Nerissa Bowes-Lyon was 22 years old. Katherine Bowes-Lyon was 15. Both had been diagnosed with severe learning disabilities. Their father, John Herbert Bowes-Lyon, was the elder brother of Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the woman who'd married into the royal family in 1923 and was, by 1941, the queen consort. Their aunt, the woman the nation would come to call the Queen Mum. So these weren't distant relations. Nerissa and Katherine were the Queen Mother's nieces, first cousins of Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, as close to the throne as you could get without sitting on it. And they weren't alone, not even close. 3 nieces of their mother Fenella, on her side of the family, not the Bowes-Lyon side, were also placed in institutions for people with learning disabilities. Idonia Elizabeth Fane, Rosemary Andrina Fane, Etheldreda Fane. 3 sisters, daughters of Fenella's own sister, committed to the same system of long-term institutional care within roughly the same period. 5 women total from the same extended family network. 5 women who vanished from drawing rooms and family photographs and Christmas dinners and were absorbed into the gray machinery of mid-century British asylums. The Fane sisters deserve more than a passing mention because their story dismantles the one defense you might offer the Bowes-Lyons, that this was an isolated, agonizing family decision made under unbearable pressure. It wasn't isolated. It was replicated. 3 sisters from one family married into or connected to another family, and across both households, the solution to intellectual disability was identical. Remove, conceal, forget. The Fane sisters were placed in institutional care and received the same nothing that Katherine and Nerissa received, the same empty visiting logs, the same institutional clothing, the same silence from the families that had produced them. They lived and died inside the system, their names absent from family correspondence, their birthdays unmarked, their existence unacknowledged in any social register or family gathering. They weren't hidden because hiding was the only option. They were hidden because hiding was the preference. Because across 2 interconnected aristocratic families, disability wasn't treated as a challenge to be met or a reality to be accommodated. It was treated as a stain to be bleached out of the family record. And the bleaching worked. For decades. Think about what that pattern tells you. One committal might be an agonizing decision made under impossible pressure, a family overwhelmed, a medical establishment insisting. 2 could still be tragic circumstance. But 5? 5 women across 2 branches of the same family, all removed, all silenced, all erased from the record? That's not a family confronting a heartbreaking situation. That's a family with a policy, a protocol. When a child didn't meet the standard, when a daughter couldn't be presented in the right rooms, couldn't make the right conversation, couldn't fulfill the narrow requirements of aristocratic lineage, the solution was institutional disposal. Quiet, clean, permanent. Now, picture the daily routine. Royal Earlswood Hospital in the 1940s and 1950s was a large Victorian facility housing hundreds of patients in communal wards. Long corridors, high windows designed to let in light but not let patients see out. Regimented schedules. Patients woke at set times, ate at set times, were moved through the day according to institutional rhythms that had nothing to do with individual needs or preferences. Clothing was communal. Garments were collected, laundered in bulk, and redistributed. When a patient died or was transferred, their clothes didn't go to a family member or get discarded. They went back into the pile. Nerissa and Katherine wore those clothes, dresses and cardigans that had belonged to strangers, to women who'd died in the beds next to them. Nothing was theirs. Now picture the same morning, 25 miles north. At Clarence's house, the Queen Mother's staff would have been preparing her day, her dresser laying out her outfit, custom-made, fitted to her exact measurements, her page arranging her schedule. In the kitchen, staff preparing meals to her personal taste. At some point, the gin and Dubonnet would appear. At some point, the Krug. She'd eat food prepared by her personal cook. from ingredients selected for her preferences, served on china she'd chosen, in rooms decorated to her specifications, in a house staffed by people whose sole job was to ensure her comfort. 25 miles. That's the distance between Krug champagne and hand-me-down cardigans from dead patients. Back to the spending. The Queen Mother's passion for horse racing was legendary and ruinously expensive. She owned more than 500 horses over the course of her life, specializing in national hunt racing, steeplechasing, and hurdling. At any given time, she had multiple horses in training. Annual costs per horse in Britain include training fees, jockey fees, veterinary bills, transport, and entry fees. Across her stable, the annual bill ran to several £100,000. Her racing colors, blue, buff stripes, black cap, were famous at Cheltenham. She was beloved there, celebrated. The crowd cheered when her horses ran. She drank Krug Grand Cuvée daily. Not on birthdays, not at Christmas. Daily. A bottle of Krug Grand Cuvée retails at well over £100. Her preferred pre-dinner cocktail was gin and Dubonnet. Her dinners were long, lavish, and frequent. She was known for entertaining that stretched late into the evening, across whichever of her 4 residences she happened to be occupying that week. And the overdraft at Coutts just kept growing. Coutts & Company, the private bank that served the royal family since 1692, maintained her account despite the mounting deficit because the Queen stood as the effective guarantor. There's a joke that circulated among palace insiders for years, that Coutts would have folded long ago if not for the Queen Mother's overdraft. It's the kind of joke that's only funny if you don't look at what was happening 25 miles south. Because here's what was happening 25 miles south. At Royal Earlswood Hospital, Nerissa and Katherine lived within the institution's standard provisions. They wore clothes supplied by the hospital, garments passed between patients as others outgrew them, wore them out, or died. They didn't have personal wardrobes. Nobody bought them anything. Not a dress, not a pair of shoes, not a hairbrush that was theirs. No birthday presents, no Christmas gifts, no cards, no letters. Staff who worked at Earlswood and later spoke to journalists used a specific word, forgotten. They said the 2 women were forgotten. No visitors came. Not from the Bowes-Lyon family, not from the royal household, not from anyone carrying any connection to the name. The Queen Mother regularly traveled between London and Windsor, a route that took her through or past the Surrey area where her nieces spent every single day of their lives for decades. She didn't stop. She didn't send anyone. She didn't inquire. And then, in 1963, someone in the family did something that crossed the line from neglect into something else entirely. Burke's Peerage, the definitive genealogical reference for British aristocratic families, the book journalists and historians treat as gospel, began listing both Katherine and Nerissa Bowes-Lyon as dead. Nerissa was 44. Katherine was 37. Both very much alive, both eating institutional meals and wearing other patients' clothes at Earlswood. Burke's obtained its data directly from the families it catalogued. The families submitted their own updates: births, marriages, deaths. Someone authorized to speak for the Bowes-Lyon family contacted Burke's Peerage and reported that 2 living women had died. That's not neglect. That's erasure. The false entries stood uncorrected for over 20 years. Anyone who checked the record, any journalist, genealogist, curious member of the public, would have found that Katherine and Nerissa Bowes-Lyon were dead. Case closed. Nothing to see. 2 women wiped from existence in the official record while still breathing, still eating, still wearing hand-me-down clothes in a ward in Surrey. Now, hold those 2 facts, the 100 servants and the hand-me-down clothes, And fast forward to 22nd January 1986. Nerissa Bowes-Lyon died that day. She was 66. She'd been a patient at Royal Earlswood for 45 years, nearly half a century inside those walls. She was buried at Redhill Cemetery near the hospital, and her grave was marked with a plastic tag. Not a headstone, not a stone marker. A plastic tag, the kind used when no family member claims responsibility for a permanent memorial. A disposable marker that would degrade in the rain within a few years. A first cousin of Queen Elizabeth II, a niece of the Queen Mother, buried under plastic. Nobody from the family attended the funeral. No flowers were sent. No obituary was placed. And because Burke's peerage had already listed Nerissa as dead since 1963, her actual death, the real one, the one that happened in a hospital bed in Surrey, produced no ripple whatsoever. She'd been fictionally dead for 23 years. Now she was actually dead. Nothing changed. But here's where it gets truly obscene. At the time Nerissa died under a plastic grave marker, her aunt, the Queen Mother, 85 years old, was serving as patron of the Royal Mencap Society. Mencap, the leading British charity for people with learning disabilities, formerly known as the Royal Society for Mentally Handicapped Children and Adults. She lent her name to this organization. She attended events on their behalf. She stood in rooms full of donors and advocates and smiled and represented the message that people with learning disabilities deserved care and dignity and inclusion. While her niece was buried under plastic, while her other niece, Katherine, still lived at Earlswood in hand-me-down clothes with no visitors and no gifts and no acknowledgement that she existed. Was the patronage guilt? Was it performance? The concealment held until April 1987, and when it broke hard. The Sun ran the story first, and it landed with the force you'd expect when a tabloid gets its teeth into the monarchy. 2 royal cousins, hidden in an asylum for decades, listed as dead in Burke's peerage while still alive. The story spread across Fleet Street within hours. Other papers picked it up, the broadsheets, the tabloids, the wire services. Then Channel 4 commissioned a documentary investigation that went deeper than any headline could. Cameras outside the institution, interviews with staff who'd worked there for years. Nurses who'd cared for Katherine and Nerissa spoke on the record, describing women who'd been abandoned completely, who had nothing of their own, who waited for visitors who never came, who showed no sign of ever having been acknowledged by the family whose surname they carried. The word they kept using was the same word: forgotten. The documentary laid the conditions bare for a television audience of millions, and the British public, people who'd waved flags for the Queen Mother at parades, who'd bought commemorative plates with her face on them, who'd genuinely believed in the warmth of the nation's grandmother, had to sit with what they were seeing. 2 women, rotting, under the most famous family name in Britain. The reaction wasn't polite discomfort. It was fury. Letters poured into newspapers. Editorial writers who'd spent careers being deferential to the crown struggled to find language soft enough to describe what had been done without using the word they clearly wanted to use: monstrous. The UPI wire service ran the story on the 6th of April 1987, confirming the core facts. 2 women committed decades earlier, declared dead by Burke's peerage since 1963, one now actually dead, the other still alive and still inside. Harold Brooks Baker, Burke's peerage publishing director, expressed public surprise at the deception and said the publication would investigate how the false entries had been included. But the mechanism wasn't exactly mysterious. Burke's received its data from the families themselves. The false entries came from the family. There was no third party to blame, no clerical error. Someone picked up the phone, or put pen to paper, and told the genealogical establishment of Britain that 2 living women were dead. Buckingham Palace's response was a masterpiece of minimalism. A spokesperson acknowledged that the Queen was aware of her cousins. Full stop. No expression of regret, no announcement of a visit to Catherine, no commitment to anything. No explanation of the Burke's peerage entries, no accounting of what the family had known and for how long. The Queen Mother made no public comment. Not a word. Not then, not ever. The most loquacious hostess in British public life, the woman who could charm a room for hours over dinner, she had nothing to say about her nieces. One thing did change after the press scrutiny. Nerissa's grave at Redhill Cemetery, the one with the plastic marker, finally received a proper headstone, more than a year after her burial, only because journalists had started asking questions about it. A simple stone, name and dates, the bare minimum of human dignity, delivered under duress. Not because the family felt shame, because the family felt cameras. And then, life continued. Katherine was eventually transferred from Earlswood to Ketwin House, a smaller residential care home in the Surrey area, as part of Britain's broader deinstitutionalization program. The massive policy shift that closed the old Victorian asylums during the 1990s and moved patients into smaller community-based settings. Across the country, institutions like Royal Earlswood were being emptied. Buildings that had warehoused thousands of people with learning disabilities for over a century were being shuttered, sold off, converted into luxury flats. The irony of that particular conversion requires no comment. Catherine's move to Ketwin House meant smaller rooms instead of communal wards, fewer patients, staff who could learn your name and use it. Something that approximated, however faintly, a home rather than a facility. By the standards of what she'd come from, 40-odd years in a Victorian asylum originally built to house people the Victorians called idiots, it was an improvement. By the standards of what her aunt was living in at the same time, it was still another universe entirely. Ketwin House didn't have 100 staff. Ketwin House didn't serve Krug. But it was, at least, a place where Katherine Bowes-Lyon could sleep in a room that wasn't a ward and wear clothes that were designated as hers. Whether the media attention from 1987 accelerated her transfer or improved her specific conditions is impossible to say with certainty. The national policy was already in motion, but the timing, the move coming in the years after the exposure, sits there, suggestive and uncomfortable. What didn't change was the silence from the family. There are no confirmed reports of the Queen Mother visiting Catherine after 1987. No confirmed reports of the Queen visiting her cousin. No confirmed reports of Princess Margaret visiting. If the family made private financial contributions to Catherine's care after the story broke, those contributions left no trace in any public record. The exposure produced an acknowledgement. It didn't produce contact. Meanwhile, the Queen Mother's 4 residences stayed open. The 100 staff stayed employed. The Krug kept flowing. The Coutts overdraft kept climbing. £4 million a year, every year, through the 1990s and into the 2000s, while Katherine Bowes-Lyon lived out her days in a Surrey care home, without a single documented visit from the family that bore her name. On 30 March 2002, the Queen Mother died at Royal Lodge, Windsor. She was 101 years old, and the full scale of the financial reality became public. The Coutts overdraft, long an open secret among royal watchers, was confirmed by The Guardian, The Telegraph, and multiple royal biographers. £7 million. Some accounts break it down as roughly $4 million in overdraft, plus additional outstanding debts and commitments. Either way, millions upon millions, accumulated over decades of spending that outpaced even the extraordinary income available to a woman whose daughter was the sovereign. Her estate was valued at an estimated £50 million, a significant art collection, jewelry, Fabergé eggs, the accumulated possessions of 101 years of privileged existence. And under the terms of a 1993 Memorandum of Understanding between John Major's government and the palace, the transfer of assets from a deceased consort to the reigning sovereign was exempt from inheritance tax. The whole lot, every painting, every egg, every piece, passed to Queen Elizabeth II tax-free. The saving was estimated at £20 million or more, a tax shelter available to literally no other family in Britain. The $7 million in debt was absorbed into the settlement, swallowed whole. The wealth moved upward, toward the crown, toward preservation. Katherine Bowes-Lyon, still alive in Surrey, received no inheritance. Nerissa Bowes-Lyon, who'd spent a year in the ground under plastic before anyone bothered with a headstone, had never received anything at all. Katherine outlived her aunt by 12 years. She died in 2014, 73 years after she'd first been placed inside Royal Earlswood Hospital as a 15-year-old girl. 73 years. She spent more time inside institutions than most people spend alive. And in all that time, through the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, through the decades when the Burke's peerage entry said she was dead, through the 1987 exposure, through the years of silence that followed, through her aunt's death and the tax-free transfer of £50 million in art and jewelry, in all that time, no member of the family is confirmed to have walked through her door. So here are your two numbers. Hold them together. £7 million in debt, accumulated through Krug champagne and racehorses, and 4 staffed residences, and 100 servants, and decades of entertaining that ran so far beyond her means that the Queen had to quietly cover the tab at Coutts. And £0 sent to Earlswood. 0 visits, 0 birthday cards, 0 Christmas presents, 0 acknowledgement in Burke's peerage that Katherine and Nerissa were even alive. 0 comment from the Queen Mother after the story broke. 0. 7 million and 0. That's the whole story. Some people will tell you it was a different time, that attitudes toward learning disabilities were different in 1941. And that's true. They were. But attitudes didn't stay frozen in 1941. The decades moved on. The 1960s came and went. The 1970s. The 1980s. Disability rights evolved. Public understanding changed. MenCap itself, the charity the Queen Mother patronized, existed specifically to change those attitudes. And through all of it, through every shift in public consciousness, Katherine and Nerissa stayed exactly where they'd been put, wearing other people's clothes, receiving nothing. 5 women across the family. 5. All disposed of, all forgotten, all left to the system while the family name gleamed on charity letterheads and racecourse programs. The Queen Mother became patron of the Royal MenCap Society. She stood in rooms and smiled and lent the weight of her name to the cause of dignity for people with learning disabilities. And in a cemetery in Redhill, her niece lay under a plastic marker because nobody in the family had bothered to buy a stone. That's not tragedy. Tragedy implies forces beyond your control. This was arithmetic. Subscribe for more stories like this.